We begin the Mishnah on Daf Chafayim and Aleph, which is a continuation of what we discussed before about Lazus Vasayim. Remember, we said under certain circumstances, we do not want a person to marry someone because people are talking about maybe he had a relationship with her while she was married, and now he waited to move in for the kill and marry. In any event, the Gemara in Masechet Yevamot has a takanas chacham. Now, there are two ways of giving a get. One is that the Megarish himself personally gives the get, and another way is, let's say he and his wife are separated by many seas, he can send a shliach from Medina Sayyam to Eretz Yisrael. So his wife is in the land of Israel, he's out there, Medina Sayyam, maybe he's afraid of quarantine, I don't know. In any event, he can appoint a shliach in Eretz Yisrael to bring him the get. However, there was a separate takana that the shliach would have to declare b'fanai nechtav and b'fanai nechtam. It's not just the shliach that is located in Eretz Yisrael. He has to start right here in Medina Sayyam together with the Baal, and he witnesses that the Baal commands, let me give a better word, commissions two witnesses to sign the get. And the get, in fact, was signed in the presence of the shliach. So when the shliach comes with this get from Medina Sayyam all the way to Eretz Yisrael, he can testify b'fanai nechtam, b'fanai nechtam, that this get was written in my presence, and it was written lishma, because the sofer, when he writes the get, will announce, I'm writing it for the purpose of this husband to divorce this wife, and mention them by name. And b'fanai nechtam, the shliach furthermore has to testify that he knows that, and he was present to watch the signatures, the signing of the get by two Eidim Ksherim. The Gemara in Masechet Gittin presents a machlokus between Rabbah and Rava as far as why this takana was established. According to Rabbah, the reason for this establishment was because back in the old days, the people in Medina Sayyam were not B'nai Torah. And the fear was that they didn't know the laws of writing a get and how to prepare a kosher get. They didn't realize, they were not aware of the fact that the get has to be written lishma, meaning for the purpose of this husband to divorce this wife. So the chash was that lest the Baal would come later on and he will say, well, this get was not written with my permission, I didn't commission the writing of the get. Or he'll come and claim the get wasn't written l'shem ha'isha, and that's going to be hotzas las. So therefore, when the shliach testifies b'fanei nechtam, the Baal is no longer believed if he comes to what's called bima'arer and cast a claim, a suspicion against the get and its kashas. Rav, on the other hand, disagrees. He says the reason why they establish this takana that the shliach is obligated, is required to testify b'fanei nechtam. It's because ein be'eretz Yisrael edim shemakirim es hachasima shel chutz la'aretz. It means the following: there weren't constant travelers going back from Medina Sayyam to Eretz Yisrael. We need, before we allow the get to be delivered by the shliach to the isha here in Eretz Yisrael, we require what's called kiyum hachasimos, which means we need two witnesses who can testify to the effect that there's no forgery here. We know their signatures. We recognize their signatures. Now, how are we going to be able to get in Eretz Yisrael, if ein shayos mitzvahs, how are we going to be able to get two witnesses to testify on these chasimos, on a get that's coming from chutzot, from Medina Sayyam? But if the shliach will testify b'fanei nechtam that I was there at the time that they signed it, then we're not going to suspect, and we won't even believe the Baal if he comes to say that this was a forgery. A maybe get Medina Sayyam, a person brings a get as a shliach from Medina Sayyam to Eretz Yisrael, and it could go the other way around. It could be let's say within Chutz La'aretz, there are two countries. There's France and Belgium. A person brings a get from France to Belgium. The Omar, the Shliach, testified in front of the Eidim, b'fanei nechtav u'b'fanei nechtav. And he fulfills the requirement of the Chachamim to testify that the get was written and signed in his presence. And the Chachamim say that since this Shliach was the one who brought about the get, I mean, he was the one who carried the get and basically delivered the get, as if he was the extended arm of the husband, lo yitzas ishto. We have an issue here of lazus sfasayim. What are you talking about? He marries this woman, the shliach himself. Maybe that indicates that he wasn't telling us a fair story, a true story. Maybe the whole story of this get was all gebluffed. It was made up by this individual because he wanted to marry this woman. He wanted to get a heter to marry this woman. So the takana was made that the shliach himself is enjoined from marrying the woman who is receiving the get from his hand, and this is all because of lazus sfasayim. Mace, what happens if the witness dies? Did I say the witness dies? What I meant to say, the witness testifies that the husband dies. Okay, so I'm going to just skip for a split second to the next part of the Mishnah that says, Lo yisa es ishto. Here you testify that the husband died, and then you go ahead and marry his wife? That looks awfully suspicious. Maybe the whole story was gebluffed in order that you should be able to marry his wife. So therefore, Lo yisa es ishto, once again, because since he testified to be mater this woman and to remove her status as an Eshes Ish, it would look like sheker if he went ahead and he married her. And once again, we have a problem of lazus fasayim. Now, what do we skip? Haragtiv, if this aide testified that I myself killed the husband. Now, why would he have killed the husband? And if he's confessing to a murder, maybe there was a civil war, I don't know. But in any event, she's allowed to marry anyone else based on his testimony, and the Gemara is going to go into that. But he himself, who testified to be matir, he cannot marry her. Again, we're always going to have to analyze whether, if he went ahead and he married her, whether we recognize the marriage. Haragnu is the same as haragtiv, but instead of singular, it's in the plural. So it means that there were a number of people involved in this murder, and we put him to death. So this one witness is testifying that together with other people, we murdered this fellow. And therefore his wife is allowed to get married. And we're going to rely on his testimony, but we're not going to allow he himself, who was the aid Hameid Lahatir, to marry because of Lazus Fas. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Haragtiv lo tinase ishto, haragnu tinase ishto. When a person testifies that he murdered the husband, then she's not allowed to get married at all to anyone. Not to him, for sure, and not to anyone else. Why? Because the very moment that he testifies that he murdered this husband, he becomes a nogea b'edus. He's testifying on himself. Now, if he testifies that someone else killed this person, so he's an objective third-party witness. But if he testifies that he himself killed the person, and now based on his credibility and his testimony, we're going to be matir the isha. We can't rely on his testimony when he's testifying about himself. And how much more so if this murder was murder? Because then, by his own admission, he is a Rotzeach. And a Rotzeach is not believed. We don't trust murderers. He's Pasal Yevis. He's a Rasha Gomer. And by his own confession, he's a Rasha. So now to take his confession and upgrade it to the status of reliable testimony, that we can't do, because by virtue of his own confession, his edus is disqualified. However, what about a case where he says haragnu, which means that there were others who were involved in murdering him? Now, the Gemara is going to interpret haragnu means that he witnessed others who killed him. He's not including himself, even though the word haragnuhu in its literal translation means we killed him, right? Haragnuhu, we killed him. But we're going to reinterpret it as hargnuhu, they killed him. And then tinase each. Then others could marry her. We rely on his testimony because he's not testifying about himself. He's not incriminating himself, but he himself cannot marry. The Gemara raises the following objection. Taima de Mimdinas Hayam. Reason why we require b'fanei nechta. And therefore, we're relying on this shliach to testify. And based on that testimony, to permit this woman to get married as a grusha. And that's because he brought the get from where? From Medina Sayyam to Eretz Yisrael. And in such a case, we don't rely on a get that came from Chutz La'aretz without the testimony of the shliach. And the shliach's testimony is what makes the get into a get. The alei on him, meaning the shliach, samchina, because samchina we are relying to be matir this woman. And Memela is lazus fasayim. Why? Because if he goes ahead and marries her, people are going to say that he only testified in order to marry her. Avol me Eretz Yisrael. The implication of the Mishnah is that if a person brings a get from one part of Eretz Yisrael to another part of Eretz Yisrael, we don't need him to testify. He doesn't have to testify about the kashrus of the get, and the get reads for itself. Meaning, we read the get, we have signatures on the get, and we rely on the get. We may need a kiyum to authenticate the signatures, but he's not the one to do so. And lava leika samchina, so we're going to be marked to the isha based on the get. Not we're relying on the get, but not on his testimony. As then Yisa, then he's allowed to marry her, and we're not afraid that maybe the whole thing was a counterfeit, and he created it this shliach in order to marry her. So there's no lazus fasayim in this case. Why? Because we're not relying on the shliach, and that's a maybe get may Eretz Yisrael. So the Gemara asks for her mace the lav alei samchinon in a case where the witness testifies that this woman's husband died. Are we basing our heter, allowing her to get remarried because of his testimony? Lav alecha samchinon. We're not relying on his testimony. What does that mean? How do we know that her husband is no longer if we don't hear from somebody that he died? The answer is the Omar Mar, the Isha Daiko Mitzvah. We cannot rely on the testimony of one aide to be matir and Ashes Ish when the testimony is Meis Baila. We have to find independent evidence in order to rely on that evidence, which is independent of his testimony, in order to be matir. And that's called Isha Daika Uminsaba. A woman, a married woman, will always investigate and interrogate until she's absolutely convinced with all certainty that her husband died, and then she'll get married. Now, you could say that that's natural. I mean, a married woman would not want to get married to someone else unless she was absolutely certain that her husband died. But it goes even beyond that, because the Mishnah later on in Masechet Yevamot is going to establish that if her husband does show up and he's alive and well, and she in the meantime got married to another man, there's mamzerus from him, from her, and all sorts of knossos and penalties and fines that they impose upon her. So she's in a very precarious situation if she relies on the flimsy testimony of one witness that her husband died. And therefore, when she is allowed, she gets a heter bezdin to marry another man, it's based on daika uminsaba. Daika uminsaba. She will be medayek before she gets married. And the fact that she got married to someone else means that she was medayek. She did all the investigation, all due diligence, and she was certain about the fact that her husband died. However, in the note here, number Lamed Hey, he quotes the Ritva. The Ritva in turn quotes the Gemara later on in Masechet Yevamot Kuf Tes Vav, and the Gemara has a possibility that we rely on one witness and we accept his credibility to testify that her husband died because of what's called Milsa Davidi Ligluye. A person will never lie about something that will be clarified later on, meaning he's telling you a story that this man died, and then the man is going to show up alive and well. That's called in the Gemara's language in Sanhedrin, Baharugul Iragla. The one who was killed came on his own 2 feet. I remember when Rav Soloveitchik took the attendance, so he mentioned the name, and the Olam said to Rav Soloveitchik he did not show up today. And then, as this was going on, he actually walked into the door. He said, Rebbe, I'm here. So the Rav said, Baharu Baraglim. I already crossed you off the list. In any event, the Gemara seems to rely on the testimony of one aide. And that's called Milsa Davir Ligluye Loma Chakri Inchi. A person doesn't lie about something that will be clarified one way or the other. He doesn't want to be shown up to be a liar. And although the Gemara is not definite that that's the reason why we rely on one aid, the Gemara has another possibility that it's only because of each Taiku Mitzvah, but nevertheless, the Gemara comes to no definite conclusion, which means that the Gemara is seriously considering the possibility that we do rely on one aid, which would mean that we are being martyred this woman to get remarried based on the testimony of this one single witness. But our Gemara apparently wants to go beyond that and say that, you know what, forget about Milsa, Davidi, Ligluye, and all that. Just let's focus on Isha Daiko Minsava, which means that we're not going to rely on one witness alone. We need Daiko Minsava. Uktani lo yisas ishto. So what happens over here? Our Mishnah says that if he brought a get as a shliach from Medina Sayam to Eretz Yisrael, and he testifies. So wait a minute. In the case where he brings a get from Chutzlaretz there we need what? We need b'fanei nechta, so we're relying on him. But what about the case where the Eid Echad says Meis Baila Lav Alei Samchinon? And why is that? Because Isha Daiku Mitzvah. One second. Again, in the case where he brings a get from Chutz La'aretz and he testifies b'fanei nechta, he's not allowed to marry her. Why? Because the heter was from him. Now, the Gemara sees an inconsistency because in the case where one aid testifies Meis Baila, nevertheless, he's not allowed to marry. Why not? The Gemara insists, Lava Leika Samchina, but rather we're going to rely on Isha Daiko Mitzvah. So Ketani Lo Yisas Ishto. If in the case of a get Medina Sayam and the Shliach says and he's not allowed to marry her because we're relying on him to create this heter, and it doesn't look very smooth. The fact that he went and married her after he testified and we relied on him. If that be the case, then why does the Mishnah prohibit Eid Echad Sheheid Meis Baila from marrying her? Why do we prohibit him from marrying her? It's not that we're relying on his testimony. We're relying on what? On Isha Daika Umitzvah. Everybody have that? Mm-hmm. Our answer is Hasam. In the case of Misa Sabal, Leka Ksava. Hacha Ika Ksava. So when a witness brings a get, the get speaks for itself, and it testifies that the husband has created this document for the purpose of being mater the Isha through Gerish. Correct? So that now the whole issue is, can we rely on the ksav, on the testimony with the two Adam signed inside the get? And the answer is that since the get came from Medina Sayyam, we're afraid that maybe it's a counterfeit. There's a forgery going on. We need the shliach to testify. And therefore the heter is totally based on the shliach. Now, in the case of Eid Echad, forget about issues of ksav, meaning whether or not there was a forgery. We must have his testimony. There's no ksav over here. He's not bringing any document. If he brings a document, then at least within Eretz Yisrael, we'll rely on the document and we'll be matir based on the get, on the ksav. But if he's coming from Chutz La'aretz, then we have to rely on his testimony. Fine. Now we get to the case of Eid Sheheid Shemeis. What does it say in the Mishnah? Meis, etc., Lo Yisas Ishto. I hear there's no difference between Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz. I mean, we don't have any ksav to rely on. There's no other eidus here in effect that her husband died except for his testimony. So he's creating the heter. Isha Daiko Mitzvah. So the Gemara says, Leka Ksava. We have no document with signatures to testify on the death of regarding the death of a husband, to rely solely on his aids. And therefore we're afraid maybe the whole story is sheker. He wanted to marry him. In the case of get in Eretz Yisrael, there's a ksava. We'll rely on the ksav. We're not going to be choshish that it's a counterfeit. This non, because we have a Mishnah later on that says ma bein get lemisa taksav mochiach. What is the question of the Mishnah later on? If a woman brings a get from Medina Sayyam to Eretz Yisrael, she shows up in a court in Eretz Yisrael. She says, "I want to get married." So the Beis Din will say to her, "What do you mean get married? Prove that you were divorced." So she produces the get. And she says, "B'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta." And we're going to rely on her testimony. If she comes and says, "Meis Baileh," then we're not going to rely on her. So why do we rely on her when she says, "B'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta"? Ma bein get le misa. So she's not believed to testify that her husband died or somebody else's husband died. And yet she is believed to say that this get is a kosher get. Why do we reject her credibility in one case and accept her credibility in the other? The answer is cheksav mochia. We're not going to rely on her testimony. We're going to rely on the shtar. So let's say, for example, a shliach brings a get in Eretz Yisrael from Dan to Beersheba, right? So we're not choshesh that it's a ziyuf, because we can rely on the get. It's only when the get is coming from Chutz La'aretz, then we're afraid that maybe they don't know, and there are people there that are not knowledgeable, and so forth and so on. So we need a testimony to establish the kashrus haget. But within Eretz Yisrael, we can rely on the get itself. And therefore, when a person is a shliach to bring a get from Dan to Beersheba, we don't require that he testify b'fanei nechta, b'fanei nechta. We're going to rely on the get itself. We don't have a chash of ziyut. And therefore, in that case, the shliach is allowed to marry the woman. But if he testifies that her husband died, the only thing is the Gemara doesn't address the issue of Daiku Mitzvah. I'm trying to figure out what the Hamamina was and what the Maskana was. Let me just read number mem. Is Biar Rashba Shebe'ed Hameid Lisa Esar Icha Chashashu Lazis Fasayan Sheyomu Sha'ed Shakar Shiker Mipshum Shirotz Lisa Ena Bekaven She Yisod Takva Afiluk Shiesh Ksav Kigon maybe get me Din Sayam Oslo Lisa Esar Isha Ki Yomru Shiker Bishvil Lisa Ena. Okay, that doesn't really help me so much. What is the difference here between the Makshon and the Tarzan? Right? The Makshon was asking, when a witness testifies Meis Bala, we're not relying on his testimony. Why? Because Isha Daiko Mitzvah. And yet it says that when a person testifies that her husband died, Lo Yisas Isha, he's not allowed to marry her. So what is the Gemara asking now? Lav Aleika Samchina. Now, if he brings a get in Eretz Yisrael, he's allowed to marry. Why? Shalo Samchinon Ale do so. We're not relying on his testimony. So again, in the case where he testifies that Meis Baila, he's not allowed to marry her, and yet we're not relying on him because we're relying on Daiku Mitzvah. So why then, in the case of maybe getting Eretz Yisrael, is he allowed to marry her? And your only possible answer is because we're not relying on him. So if we're not relying on him, then in the case of Meis Baila, we're not relying on him, we're relying on Daiku Mitzvah. So that was the question of the Gemara. Right? Fagam the Omer Meis Baila Charei Vade Tzorches Dvar Shel Ha'ev. In the case of a get in Eretz Yisrael, he just has to present the get. That's all. And the rest is done by itself. We don't need his aid. But in Meis Bailach, we need his aid. So what's the Gemara asking him? Again, in the case of maybe get the Eretz Yisrael, he's allowed to marry her, and we're not afraid that he's lying. If the Baal will come and say that I wouldn't trust the Shliach, he's not believed, so the Shliach, therefore, is afraid that maybe the Baal will show up and claim that the Shliach was lying. Therefore, we're not going to be Choshesh for Sheker in a case of maybe get Eretz Yisrael. And therefore, we can marry. Now, in the case where the aide is testifying that her husband died, is therefore what? Maybe the Baal will show up alive and well. He's not going to lie. That's what he said was a Milsa David Lui. He's not going to lie. So why isn't he allowed to marry? In the case when he brings a get in Eretz Yisrael, we're not afraid that he's going to lie because he realizes that the Baal has the ability to cast an aspersion on him and claim that he was never sent as a shliach. Therefore, we believe he's not lying. It's a milsa david gluye. Why not apply the same logic? Right? And therefore, since we're not afraid that he's lying, therefore he's allowed to marry this woman. Why not apply the same logic in the case of what? Of Meis Bailach, that he's not going to lie because the Baal is going to show up on his 2 feet. Oh, so if he's not lying, then we should allow him to marry. The Gemara says, the Omar Mar Isha Daiko Mitzvah. All right, so that's a question. Why did the Gemara mention Daiko Mitzvah? It's lav dafka. What the Gemara means to say is that we don't believe he's a liar. Because it's a miltzah davida likluye, he's afraid to lie because just give me 1 second, Steve. I'm almost there. Lav aleika samchinon. Lav aleika samchinon. So the Gemara is asking, why not be consistent? In the case of get the Eretz Yisrael, we say he's allowed to marry her because we're not relying on him, which means that he's basically telling the truth. And if he's telling the truth, we're not afraid that maybe the Baal right, because since he's afraid of the Baal, therefore he's going to tell the truth. And if he's telling us that he was appointed as a shliach, then we can rely on him. And then we're not. And what? No. Say it better than that. Not that we were going to rely on him. We're going to assume that he's telling the truth. If we assume he's telling the truth, then there's not going to be lazus v'sayim if he marries him. And the same logic should apply in the case of Eis Bailach, where we assume he's telling the truth. And we should allow him to marry her. Yeah, go ahead, Steve. Now I think I have the kasha. Now I want to see the teretz.
Right.
You're already up to teretz?
No.
Oh, okay, good. Because I'm not up to teretz.
In the case of the cat, he knows that the husband is alive.
Wait. I lost you. In the case of the get,
he knows the husband's alive and could always come and contradict them.
Okay. So
he would be afraid to
make up a story,
knowing that he's alive and
that he was appointed by the Baal to bring this get.
Right.
So therefore, in Eretz Yisrael, where there are no issues of, let's say, Lishma and Kiyum and so forth and so on, then we believe that the Shliach is telling the truth, and hence he's allowed to marry. So if your rule of thumb in answering your criterion and answering the question whether or not we will allow him to marry her is he believed or not, then in the case of Eis Baila, we should also believe him because the Milsa David he's not going to lie, and then the husband's going to show up and he looks like a fool, he's an outright liar, then we should allow him to marry her. So what's the Gemara's answer? Ito mochiach olav, right? We have a concept of ksava. In the case of Misa Sabal, we totally have to rely on him. He has no proof whatsoever to support his testimony that her husband died. And the Gemara is saying, therefore, we're not going to assume that he's definitely telling the truth. He may be fabricating it. So therefore, we cannot allow him to marry. In the case of maybe forget about him. We know that we have every right to assume that this get is a reliable get. It was written, Lishma was commissioned by the Baal and it was signed by 2 witnesses. We're not afraid of a forgery. So the get speaks for itself. And therefore, we believe that this is a true story. There's no fabrication here. The get itself is enough. And we're going to prove that from a Mishnah later on, that a woman who brings her own get from Medina Sayyam is believed. She would not be believed to say Meis Baila, to be matter that woman to marry someone else. And the Mishnah asks, Ma ben get levisa? Why is she believed when she produces her get? she's not believed to testify that the husband of that wife died? And the answer is that she's believed on her own get because ksav mochia. Ksav mochia. I'm not sure exactly what that means, because we're talking about a get that came from Medina Sayyam, are we not? So if she's bringing a get from Medina Sayyam, so what does that mean, ksav mochia? 1 second. I don't get it. If it's a get from Medina Sayyam, why is it called ksav mochia? Is there a kiyum on the get? I mean, what's in the get?
No, there isn't. There's still a chashash on it. Still a get. There's still a physical piece of paper.
It's better than nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
He writes here, ksav mochiach ein somchim al eduson el al ashtar. Just 1 second. So it's not, as you say, Jeff, it's not just purely her word. Mashen Kain and Misa, it's her word. I mean, there's nothing to support that claim.
No, but if she brought a coroner's report from a law,
Right.
from a guy, there's no name on this, then that might be a similar thing. Where, yeah, we don't really rely on the coroner's report, but there is a coroner's report. So maybe that with her testimony
Might be sufficient.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to figure out. So again, the Gemara is using that as a proof that Mishnah to the original answer. Let's go back to the original answer. Gemara hasam lekak sava hacha ikak sava. So when a person testifies on the death of her husband, then we're totally relying on his testimony. We have no documents to support his claim. And even though, again, we can rely on him because of Milsa Davidu Ligluye, he's afraid that the Baal will show up. But okay, at the end of the day, we're relying on him. Yeah, but we just finished saying the Makshin was telling us that if there's no Chashash Sheker, and he's telling the truth, then why not allow him to marry her? So what is lekak so? Just let's focus our attention on those two words for a moment. Lekak so. We're relying totally on his testimony that her husband died. There is no documents to support it. And therefore we're afraid that maybe he's lying. How did the Gemara backtrack from the Havamina? The Havamina was, we're not afraid that he's lying because the Baal himself might show up on 2 feet. I'm reading here, this is a quote from the Rashba, the Ritva. Masha Eid Echad, footnote number Lamed Hey. Masha Eid Echad, Nemon B'misa Sabal, Umishum Shemilsa Davida Ligluye, the Lo Chayshinan, and she is Shakirbo, even she is Baradov. He's not going to say, falsify his testimony with a perjury and say something that will be mavar that he's lying. So what's the Gemara saying now? No, we are afraid that he's lying. Why is the Gemara backtracking?
Yeah, we'll see it with Gemara. This seems to be a gay of a divine.
See, the difference between me and you, Jeff, is that you don't have the Masechet in front of you. I'm somehow, I'm sort of, you're a free agent. I'm sort of committed to this language. He's quoting the Rashba. Again, you don't have it. I can give it to you. We can photocopy. It's footnote number Lamed Vav. He's saying the following: that Hatam Shamevi get the Eretz Yisrael mutal olisa oso v'lo chayshinin shemeshaker mishum shemabal yavov ya'arer ein hashliach nemon v'tzorch l'kaimo l'chein hashliach mefached l'shaker shema yovo haba ukmo chen yesh lomar shameid al misas habal mefached l'shaker shema yovo habal the nimtza mukhosh. So again, it all comes back to the same three words: lo chayshinan shemeshaka. Therefore, the Gemara is asking, "V'lama asru lo lisa os." Just 1 second. So he doesn't have a ksav. So the Gemara's answer is that it's not enough to say Ein Choshesh and Shema Yishak. There's got to be other evidence. And the Gemara now in the answer, I think, is making a breakthrough. When you say that, do we rely on him or do we not rely on him? Will he be allowed to marry or will he not? It all depends upon whether he's Chashed l'Shakir or not. No, the Gemara is saying that's not enough. In every case, there's always some element of a chashash shek. You can give me all psychological explanations and proofs and supports to indicate that he's telling the truth. He's afraid of this, he's afraid of that, he must be telling the truth. Wonderful. But tachlis, am I relying on him? And there's always some element of possibility of fear that he's lying. Now, if that be the case, then why is it that in the case that he brought a get in Eretz Yisrael and he testifies, I'm the shliach, and here's the get, he's allowed to marry her? Because the whole Mishnah formulates it that the shliach can't marry her because he was maybe Medina Sayyam, implying that the Eretz Yisrael we believe. So you tell me, well, he's not going to lie because the Baal is going to come by and say, I never appointed you as a shliach, the whole thing is bluff. That's not enough. There must be another reason. So you're going to have to say X plus Y. We're going to need another factor here that cashes in and justifies why we are absolutely convinced that he's telling the truth. And perhaps that evidence has to be independent of his statement, because if it's only his statement, then again, you're going to come back to all these spars that it's not worth it for him to lie. You know what? It's worth it for him to lie. He's taking the chances. His reputation is on the line, but he's worth it. Why? Because he wants to marry this woman. And we can do everything for the sake of love and marriage. Right? So there must be, says the Gemara, in the case of maybe get me Eretz Yisrael, another element of credibility that's independent of his statement. And that's what the Gemara is answering here, that although in aid on Misas Habal, there is no even a scratch of evidence independent of his testimony. Which means that we totally rely on his testimony, that he's not lying. Maybe he was lying. Maybe he does want to marry this girl. He's willing to put his But in the case of get be'eretz Yisrael, ika ksava, we have independent evidence to the effect that she is allowed to get married because she's already divorced. And why do we say there's a valid divorce here? Because there's a valid get. He's holding on to a get, and the get speaks. And the get tells us that he's not making up a whole story, and he was never sent as a shliach, and he forged the whole get from A to Z. No. We're going to rely on the get. Now, who says that there is such a thing? Man, can you prove to me that we're relying on the get? And I'll prove it to you from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah asks, why is a woman believed to bring her own get from Medina Sayyam to Eretz Yisrael, and will allow her to get married based on her testimony? B'fanei nechtam, she says. But she's not believed on Misa. And the answer is because in Misa, there is no independent evidence. It's all her one voice. And she doesn't have that nemonis. But in the case where she brings a get, that get is independent of her voice. It's a separate element of evidence. And we're going to rely on that get. And that's called, in the language of the Mishnah, Haksav Mochiach. Again, I just want to make sure I have it. In the Havamina, we thought that he should be believed. And in the case of get, he's believed because he's afraid to be found into a liar. And therefore, we're going to allow him to marry the woman because he's believed. But in the case, and l'chora, we should apply the same yardstick, the same logic to the case of Misa Baal. He's afraid that the Baal may show up and he's proven to be a liar. Well, the Gemara answers that what? That in the case of Misa Sabal, we are totally relying on him. Therefore, he can't marry. So the Makshin was very well founded, because at the end of the day, if a man testifies that this woman's husband died, somebody else other than him is allowed to marry her. So that's the proof is in the pudding here, that we do rely on the Eidecha. And he's not a liar. So what was the Gemara's answer? That there's no other evidence. But so what if there's no evidence? You're telling me that he's believed. So the Gemara apparently is saying now, maybe the Gemara is changing in the teretz its understanding of the Isser for him to marry. So 1 second, let's just see. Maybe that's the way we should go here. I just thought of something. But in the case of get the Eretz Yisrael, we have the get. Maybe that's what removes the Lazarus Vasayim, the fact that we have the get. We're not relying totally on him. We have independent evidence. Araya, she's believed from, in the case of Chutz La'aretz of she's believed to say this is fine, because we have independent evidence. And that's enough in the case of maybe get the Eretz Yisrael to remove Lazarus Vasayim. Because in the eyes of the spectator, her license, her head to get married, is based on some independent evidence, namely the get itself. But there will be Lazarus Vasayim in a case where we have no independent evidence and we're relying totally on his testimony. And that's going to be the case of Meis Bala. And again, we're not operating with a chashash sheker. The Makshon, when he asked the question, he thought that the whole criterion, everything that hinges on whether or not there's a chashash sheker. If there's no chashash sheker, then why should it be lazis fasayim? And the very fact that we rely on him when he testifies meis bailach means that we're not choshesh. He's telling the truth because otherwise he's going to be a fool when the dead man shows up on 2 feet. So in the case of maybe get the Eretz Yisrael, since he doesn't want to look like a fool if the husband comes out and shows up at best and says the whole thing is fabricated, it's all a ziyuv, we rely on him. So from the perspective of chashash sheker, I have 2 cases. In both cases, we rely on him. We'll be mata the isha for acherim. Ella, what is lasses fasayim? So what's your distinction between the 2 cases? There's no lasses fasayim in the case of get the Eretz Yisrael. A shliach brings a get from Dan to Beersheba. The reason why there's no lasses fasayim is because we're not afraid he's lying. What is lasses fasayim? Lasses fasayim means the man is telling a story. He's just interested in marrying this woman. So now I think what the Gemara is doing in the Teretz, it's redefining the assumptions, the basic underlying assumptions of lazus fasayim. The determining factor of lazus fasayim is not whether we believe him or not. You're right. There's no way I can reject the makshan. In both cases, whether it's get b'toch Eretz Yisrael or whether it's misas abal, he is believed. There's no chashash sheker, otherwise how could somebody else marry him? But when it comes to lazuz fasayim, in the psychology of the onlooker, there's a whole different variable that enters into the equation. And that is, are you relying on him or is there independent evidence? If you're relying on him, don't tell me that he's believed. I'm a sinner. I'm a choshen b'ksheker. You know, you have different personality types. You know, some people are more optimistic. I believe everyone. And there are other people who go to the other extreme. I don't believe anyone. Everyone's a liar. I hope the truth is somewhere in the middle. I think this real azam. But in the eyes of someone who thinks that everyone's a liar, I don't care about all the evidence the man is bringing to support him. You relied on his testimony. The whole thing was gebluffed. I'll prove it to you. He's marrying this woman. That's lazus fasayim. So the Gemara and says we could be mashtik, you know, we could quiet down the suppressed lazuz fasayim if we tell the people that, listen, we're not really relying on him. There's some other independent evidence. And herein lies the difference between maybe get b'toch Eretz Yisrael and the case of meis bailach. In the case of meis bailach, there's no other evidence. There's not a sheepskin of some evidence to testify that the husband died. He's out there in Medina Sayyam. Maybe the man is, you know, he's playing in the in Vegas, you know, he's playing the roulette, you know, he's playing with slot machines. What do you mean he's dead? How do you know he's dead? You're relying on this guy. And now he wants to marry him? Oh man, there's smoke, there's fire. But in the case of maybe get, there's a get, there are 2 Eidim signed on the get. We have every reason to believe that the get was signed properly. We're not relying totally on him. I mean, what bothers me about this is if my pshat is correct, and the Gemara is introducing elements here that are not purely halach. The Gemara is really using psychological elements here. You know, I'm always nervous about that. I like to learn the Gemara on a very conceptual, theoretical level. But here, I'm tempted to think the Gemara is redefining lazus fasayim. In both cases, we're believing. In both cases, we're not introducing a chashash sheker. And the Makshan is 100% right. And the Tarsa never rejected those premises. Or rather introduced another variable into the equation. That psychological feeling of are we relying on him or are we not? Oh boy. See, this is what Yevamot is. I mean, how many lines of Gemara did we do today? I'm embarrassed to say, maybe 5 lines, but
I think one other difference is the get, the physical get starts the process of the investigation and determination. And in the other case, it's the man himself who starts the process.
That's very important, right?
And so,
Like, let's say the shliach was mute. He was what's called a cherish she'eino medaber. Here, read the get. You know, I'm not going to say a word. I can't speak. Read the get. The get tells the whole story. That's not enough. We need him to tell us. Well, that's in a get that's coming from Chutzpah. It's in a get that's coming from Eretz Yisrael. All he has to tell us is that he was commissioned as a shliach to bring the get. He doesn't have to add anything that he saw the get and written, and it was commissioned by the husband, so forth and so on. So the get was given to me, fait accompli, after it was completed by the Baal. But I'll slick in the get. The whole story is in the get. I mean, you know, a mute cannot testify that your husband died. He may be silent, but you know, he's got to testify. And now he goes ahead and he marries this woman. Like, what's going on over here? You rely totally on his nemanis, and then he married. Yeah, the answer is we rely totally on his nemanis because there's no mashakim. The guy's going to show up, you know, take the next plane out from Las Vegas and show up here in Yerushalayim. You know, he's alive and well. So we rely on one. And the sticky part of the Gemara is this Daiku Mitzvah. But the Rishonim are not operating with Daiku Mitzvah. Like, it's almost they ignore it completely. All right, so where are we up to here? Tomorrow, what's tomorrow is Friday, right? So on Yom Rishonim, it's Hashem, we're up to Mace Haragtiv Haragnu, correct? So where is that? Okay, it's about 7 lines up before the end.
Right.
All right, so that's for Yom Rishon. So I wish you a great Shabbos. Parshas Vayigash.
Yeah, I'm thinking also about the Matzah. In what situation she's allowed to marry? The situation is he's not allowed to marry her.
Right.
So
when you say the other situation, it's all the same situation, but the different rulings. In that one situation, one ruling is she can marry anyone in the world but him,
right.
And the other ruling is she can't marry him. But it's all the same scenario.
But that's the same thing. I mean,
I lost you.
in the Matzah situation, it shows up religiously that there's no chasash, all the marriages. Valid that she's allowed to marry anyone,
Including him,
in
Eretz Yisrael. But if he's bringing from Chutz La'aretz, she can't marry him.
right, but she can marry anyone else.
Anyone else.
Right.
Okay.